The morning mist clung to the English Channel like smoke from a dying fire, and through it came the thunder of 20 Messerschmitt 109 fighters, their yellow noses cutting through the gray September air like wasps searching for honey. Flight Lieutenant James Harrison Whitmore pulled his Supermarine Spitfire into a climbing turn, his gloved hand steady on the controls, despite the impossible mathematics staring him in the face through his canopy. 20-1. The odds that should have meant certain death. His radio crackled with static and the distant voices of his squadron, but they were 15 miles southeast, engaged with German bombers over Dover. He was alone, completely, utterly alone. Below him, the port city of Portsmouth stretched out like a map, its naval yards and dockyards crowded with destroyers and merchant vessels that represented Britain's lifeline to survival. The German fighters were diving now, splitting into attack formations, their pilots confident that one lone British fighter posed no threat to their mission. Whitmore's heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Merlin engine surge with 1,200 horsepower of raw fury. In 30 seconds, everything would change. No one in the Royal Air Force knew that one man's calculated madness that morning would rewrite the textbook on aerial combat forever. James Harrison Whitmore had been born in a small Yorkshire village called Thornaby-on-Tees on March 22, 1918, the son of a coal miner and a schoolteacher who taught him that cleverness could overcome almost any disadvantage if applied with enough determination. His father, William Whitmore, had survived the trenches of the Somme and returned home with a profound understanding that sometimes the most dangerous thing a man could do was exactly what his superiors expected him to do. Young James absorbed this lesson through countless evenings listening to his father's stories about how individual soldiers had saved their units by thinking beyond their orders, by seeing opportunities that rigid military doctrine had missed. When James turned 16, he discovered flying through a local aerodrome where wealthy gentlemen played with their private aircraft on weekends. He worked as a mechanic's apprentice for 2 years, learning every bolt and wire of aircraft engines until the day a pilot failed to show up for a demonstration flight. James climbed into the cockpit and flew the aircraft as if he had been born in the sky. By 1938, he had earned his commercial pilot's license and was instructing students at a flying school in Lincolnshire. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, James Whitmore walked into the Royal Air Force Recruitment Office in Lincoln and volunteered for fighter pilot training. The recruitment sergeant looked at the young man's working-class accent and calloused hands and nearly dismissed him as unsuitable for the officer ranks. But James had brought his flight logbook, 400 hours of flying time, including aerobatics and night flying. The sergeant reconsidered. During training at the Royal Air Force College Cranwell, James struggled with the social expectations of being an officer, but excelled at everything involving aircraft. His instructors noted that he possessed an unusual ability to visualize three-dimensional combat geometry, to see angles and opportunities that other pilots missed. He could calculate intercept courses in his head while performing barrel rolls, could estimate fuel consumption while executing split-second combat maneuvers. Most importantly, he demonstrated what his instructors called tactical flexibility, the capacity to abandon established attack patterns when circumstances demanded improvisation. By May of 1940, Pilot Officer James Whitmore had been assigned to No. 610 Squadron, flying Supermarine Spitfires from Biggin Hill. His fellow pilots initially regarded him with the polite skepticism that university-educated young men reserved for working-class newcomers, but James earned their respect through consistently precise flying and an uncanny ability to spot enemy aircraft before anyone else. During his first month of combat operations over Dunkirk, he shot down 3 German bombers and damaged 2 fighters without suffering any damage to his own aircraft. His squadron commander, squadron leader Reginald Mathers, wrote in James's evaluation that the young pilot possessed exceptional situational awareness and displayed aggressive tactics tempered by sound judgment. What squadron leader Mathers did not know was that James had begun developing his own theories about fighter combat, theories that contradicted every lesson taught at flying school, but were based on careful observation of German tactics and his own mathematical analysis of relative aircraft performance. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The summer and early autumn of 1940 marked the most critical period in British history since the Norman conquest 874 years earlier. The German Luftwaffe, having conquered Poland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France with devastating efficiency, now turned its attention to Britain. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring commanded over 2,600 fighter aircraft and bombers, organized into 3 massive air fleets positioned along the French and Norwegian coasts. Against this armada, the Royal Air Force Fighter Command could field fewer than 700 operational fighters, primarily Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes. The mathematics appeared impossibly stark, but the British possessed 2 crucial advantages that German intelligence had underestimated. First, they were fighting over their own territory, which meant that British pilots who survived being shot down could potentially return to combat, while German pilots became prisoners of war. Second, Britain's radar early warning system provided fighter command with the ability to detect incoming raids and position defensive fighters with unprecedented precision. But radar could not overcome the fundamental arithmetic of aerial combat. German bomber formations typically flew with escort fighters in ratios of 2-to-1, sometimes 3-to-1. When British fighters intercepted these formations, they found themselves consistently outnumbered and forced to choose between attacking the bombers and defending themselves against the escorts. Royal Air Force doctrine emphasized coordinated squadron attacks, with 12 aircraft attacking as a unit under tight radio control from their commander. This approach worked well during peacetime training exercises, but proved increasingly inadequate against German formations that might include 60 or 70 aircraft spread across multiple altitude levels. Individual British pilots began developing their own tactical innovations, often in direct contradiction to established doctrine. Some pilots discovered that diving attacks from high altitude could disrupt German formations even when the attacker was heavily outnumbered. Others learned to use cloud cover and sun angles to achieve surprise against numerically superior forces. But these innovations remained individual experiments, not systematic changes to fighter command tactics. The official tactical manual still recommended that British fighters avoid combat against odds greater than 2-to-1, and specifically warned against engaging large formations without adequate support. Squadron leader Mathers had briefed his pilots that morning on the importance of maintaining formation discipline and avoiding individual heroics that might compromise overall squadron effectiveness. The briefing took place in a small hut beside the runway at Biggin Hill, with 24 pilots seated on folding wooden chairs, while Mathers pointed to a large map of southeastern England covered with red pins marking German airfield locations. Intelligence reports indicated that the Luftwaffe was planning a major attack on naval facilities along the south coast, possibly involving more than 200 bombers with heavy fighter escort. Number 610 Squadron would be part of a coordinated defense involving 3 squadrons with specific instructions to concentrate on the bombers while avoiding prolonged combat with German fighters. The mathematics of the coming battle were sobering even under the best circumstances. At 8:47 that September morning, the radar station at Dover began tracking a large formation approaching from the southeast at 20,000 feet altitude. Within minutes, the plotting board at Fighter Command Headquarters showed more than 150 German aircraft heading directly toward Portsmouth. 3 British squadrons scrambled immediately, climbing to intercept altitude while ground controllers provided course corrections by radio. James Whitmore's Spitfire was the 3rd aircraft off the runway, following Squadron Leader Mathers and Flight Lieutenant Robert Sterling, his closest friend in the squadron. The weather was marginal for flying, with broken cloud layers at different altitudes and visibility reduced by industrial smoke from Portsmouth's naval yards. As the 12 Spitfires climbed through 10,000 feet, Mathers received updated intelligence from ground control. The German formation had split into 2 groups, with bombers continuing toward Portsmouth, while fighters swept ahead to clear British defenders from their path. It was a standard Luftwaffe tactic, designed to force British fighters into premature combat with the escorts rather than allowing them to reach the bombers. Mathers made the tactically correct decision to continue climbing, hoping to position his squadron above the German fighters before committing to battle. But at 15,000 feet, everything went wrong simultaneously. Flight Lieutenant Sterling's engine began trailing smoke from a mechanical failure, forcing him to turn back toward base. 2 other aircraft reported radio problems that prevented them from receiving tactical instructions. Most critically, ground control announced that the German bomber formation had suddenly changed course, dividing into 3 separate groups approaching Portsmouth from different directions. Squadron Leader Mathers found himself facing an impossible choice. He could maintain formation discipline and attempt to intercept one of the bomber groups with his remaining 9 aircraft, or he could split his force to cover multiple approach routes. Either option meant abandoning the tactical advantages of coordinated attack. Fighter command doctrine had no answer for this type of multi-axis threat. As Mathers hesitated, trying to evaluate his limited options, James Whitmore spotted something that changed everything. Through a gap in the clouds below, he could see the glint of sunlight reflecting off aircraft canopies. A formation of German fighters was climbing steeply from the south, positioning themselves to attack any British aircraft that committed to engaging the bombers. It was a trap, carefully orchestrated to destroy Britain's defensive fighters before they could interfere with the bombing mission. James keyed his radio transmitter to warn Squadron Leader Mathers, but his radio had joined the growing list of equipment failures plaguing the squadron that morning. He tried hand signals, but Mathers was focused on the radio chatter from ground control and did not see James's frantic gesturing. The German fighters continued climbing, now less than 2 miles away, and perfectly positioned to bounce the British squadron from below. James faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could maintain formation discipline, stay with his squadron, and hope that someone else would spot the approaching threat in time to react. Or he could break formation, dive toward the German fighters, and attempt to disrupt their attack, even though it meant fighting alone against impossible odds. Everything he had been taught at flying school argued for the first option. Individual heroics got pilots killed and compromised mission effectiveness. But everything his father had taught him about survival argued for the second. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man could do was exactly what his superiors expected him to do. James pushed his control stick forward and dropped out of formation like a stone falling from the sky. Squadron Leader Mathers, still absorbed in radio communications with ground control, did not immediately notice that one of his pilots had disappeared. James's Spitfire accelerated rapidly as it dove, the airspeed indicator climbing past 300 miles per hour, while the German fighters grew larger in his windscreen. He could count them now. 20 Messerschmitt 109 fighters in 4 separate flights, climbing in a loose formation that would bring them into perfect firing position behind the British squadron within 60 seconds. The lead German pilot was Hans-Joachim Marseille, though James had no way of knowing that he was diving toward one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter aces. Marseille had scored 47 confirmed victories flying over France and was considered by German intelligence to be the most tactically innovative pilot in his wing. He had specifically requested this mission because intelligence reports suggested that British fighter tactics remained predictably rigid, making them vulnerable to the type of coordinated attack he had planned. What Marseille had not anticipated was that one British pilot might abandon formation discipline entirely and attempt a frontal attack against a 20-to-1 disadvantage. James's Spitfire screamed down through the gap between cloud layers, its Merlin engine producing maximum power as he pushed the throttle to emergency settings. At this speed and angle, he would have perhaps 10 seconds of firing time before the relative positions of the aircraft made accurate gunnery impossible. 10 seconds to disrupt an attack formation that had been planned and rehearsed by some of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots. 10 seconds to prove that sometimes individual madness could achieve what tactical orthodoxy could not. He selected all 8 of his machine guns and set his gun sight for a range of 200 yards, knowing that he would need to fire at much closer distance to achieve the shock effect he was gambling everything on. The lead Messerschmitt was now clearly visible through his gun sight, its yellow nose and black crosses sharp against the gray background of cloud. Behind it, the other 19 German fighters maintained their climbing formation, completely focused on intercepting squadron leader Mathers and his 9 remaining Spitfires. None of them had spotted the lone British fighter diving toward them from above. James had achieved complete tactical surprise, but surprise alone would not be enough to survive what happened next. As the range closed to 400 yards, he could see the German pilots in their cockpits, their heads turned upward toward the British formation they were preparing to attack. 300 yards, 250 yards. James's finger tightened on the firing button, but he forced himself to wait. At this closing speed, he would have only one opportunity to achieve maximum effect. If he opened fire too early, the German pilots would have time to react and turn the engagement into a conventional dogfight, where 20-to-1 odds meant certain death. If he waited too long, he would overshoot the formation without firing at all. 200 yards. James Whitmore squeezed the firing button and felt his Spitfire shudder as 8 Browning machine guns erupted simultaneously, sending a concentrated stream of 30-caliber rounds directly into the heart of the German formation. The first burst struck Hans-Joachim Marseille's Messerschmitt at a range of 180 yards, sending a shower of metal fragments and hydraulic fluid streaming back from the German fighter's engine cowling. Marseille, caught completely by surprise, instinctively pulled his aircraft into a steep right turn while white smoke poured from his damaged engine. The sudden maneuver broke the formation discipline of his flight, causing the 3 aircraft following him to scatter in different directions to avoid collision. James's Spitfire flashed through the gap they created, its guns still firing, and his second burst caught a Messerschmitt from the second flight at point-blank range. The German pilot, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, had barely begun to react to the unexpected attack when 30-caliber rounds shattered his canopy and severed the control cables to his rudder and elevators. Weber's aircraft immediately entered an uncontrolled dive toward the English Channel, trailing black smoke and pieces of torn aluminum. But James was not finished. His diving attack had carried him completely through the first 2 flights of German fighters and positioned him directly in front of the third flight, which was climbing steeply and had not yet realized what was happening. James hauled back on his control stick, pulling his Spitfire into a climbing turn that brought him face to face with 4 more Messerschmitts at a combined closing speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. For 3 seconds, the opposing aircraft flew directly toward each other, neither side willing to break off and yield the initiative. James fired his third burst at a range of less than 100 yards, watching his tracers converge on the lead Messerschmitt's propeller spinner. The German pilot, Unteroffizier Friedrich Beckmann, attempted to return fire, but James's round struck his aircraft before he could bring his guns to bear. Beckman's engine seized immediately, freezing his propeller and forcing him to attempt a dead-stick landing in the channel. The psychological effect of James's attack rippled through the entire German formation like a shock wave. Pilots who had been focused on executing a carefully planned intercept suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction by an enemy who appeared willing to ram them rather than break off. The tight formation discipline that had made their attack possible became a liability as aircraft scattered to avoid both James's guns and each other. Radio discipline collapsed as 20 German pilots began talking simultaneously, trying to coordinate a response to an attack that had lasted less than 20 seconds and had already eliminated 3 of their number. But James was not finished, and the mathematics of aerial combat were about to become even more brutal. His diving attack had converted altitude into speed, and he still carried enough momentum to climb back up through the disorganized German formation. As he pulled out of his dive and began climbing again, he spotted 2 Messerschmitts that had collided during the confusion of his initial attack. The pilots, Feldwebel Otto Schneider and Gefreiter Hans Müller, had been flying wing to wing when Schneider attempted a sharp turn to avoid James's line of fire. Müller, following standard formation procedure, had tried to maintain position on his leader's wing, but had misjudged the turn radius. The 2 aircraft struck each other at nearly 300 miles per hour, their wings interlocking for a brief moment before both fighters broke apart and began tumbling toward the earth. Neither pilot survived to reach the channel. James counted the results of his 30-second attack as he climbed away from the scattered German formation. 5 confirmed victories, with 3 aircraft destroyed by gunfire and 2 destroyed by collision. 15 German fighters remained airborne, but their formation discipline was completely broken, and their tactical advantage over squadron leader Mathers had been eliminated. More importantly, the psychological shock of losing 5 aircraft to a single enemy fighter had shattered the confidence that had made their coordinated attack possible. Hans-Joachim Marseille, his engines smoking and his fuel system damaged, made the decision to abort the mission and return to base. One by one, the surviving German pilots followed his lead, abandoning their attack on the British squadron to focus on their own survival. Squadron leader Mathers and his 9 remaining Spitfires never came under attack. The immediate aftermath of James Whitmore's 32nd engagement sent ripples through both the Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe that would influence aerial tactics for the remainder of the war. Squadron leader Mathers, who had been preparing his pilots for a defensive engagement against overwhelming odds, suddenly found himself flying through empty sky as the German attack formation disintegrated around him. His radio crackled with confused reports from his pilots describing aircraft falling from the sky and German fighters fleeing toward France, but no one could explain what had triggered the enemy's sudden withdrawal. It was not until the squadron landed back at Biggin Hill that ground observers were able to piece together what had happened. A radar operator at Dover had tracked a single aircraft diving through the German formation at tremendous speed, followed immediately by the breakup of the enemy attack. Flight Lieutenant Robert Sterling, who had been forced to return early due to engine problems, had witnessed the final moments of James's attack from 10 miles away and provided the first eyewitness account of the impossible engagement. Within hours, intelligence officers from Fighter Command Headquarters arrived at Biggin Hill to interview James and reconstruct the tactical details of his attack. The debriefing lasted 6 hours and produced a minute-by-minute analysis of what Royal Air Force tacticians quickly recognized as a completely new approach to fighter combat. James had violated every principle of formation, flying, and defensive tactics taught at flying school, yet had achieved the most decisive victory against numerical superiority in the history of aerial warfare. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in James's decision-making process during the crucial seconds before his attack. How had he recognized that the German formation was vulnerable to frontal assault? How had he calculated the timing necessary to achieve surprise? Most importantly, how had he overcome the psychological pressure that should have prevented him from attacking against 20-1 odds? James's answers revealed a tactical philosophy that differed fundamentally from established Royal Air Force doctrine. He had not attempted to engage all 20 German fighters simultaneously. Instead, he had focused on disrupting their formation cohesion by attacking their most vulnerable point, the lead flight that was guiding the entire attack. By eliminating the formation leaders and creating confusion among the followers, he had transformed a coordinated attack into an uncoordinated retreat. The intelligence officers realized that James had intuited principles of aerial combat that matched theories being developed by Germany's most innovative tacticians, but had applied them in reverse to defeat German formations rather than British ones. Fighter Command immediately classified the debriefing report and distributed copies to squadron commanders throughout the United Kingdom. Within 2 weeks, Royal Air Force pilots were receiving new tactical guidance that emphasized individual initiative and formation disruption over rigid adherence to coordinated attack patterns. The impact on German morale was equally significant, but took longer to become apparent. Hans-Joachim Marseille survived his damaged aircraft's emergency landing in France, but his confidence in German tactical superiority had been permanently shaken. In his post-mission report, he described the British attack as tactically impossible but devastatingly effective, and recommended immediate changes to Luftwaffe formation procedures. His wingman, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, was rescued from the English Channel by a German patrol boat, but suffered injuries that ended his flying career. The 3 pilots whose aircraft had been destroyed by James's gunfire were listed as missing in action, their fate unknown to German intelligence until after the war. Most significantly, word of the engagement spread through German fighter squadrons via the informal networks that connected pilots across different wings. The story grew in the telling, with James's single Spitfire eventually being described as an entire British squadron that had appeared from nowhere and vanished like ghosts. German fighter pilots began reporting mysterious attacks by small numbers of British aircraft that struck without warning and disappeared before defensive measures could be organized. The strategic implications of James Whitmore's 32nd victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Fighter Command analysts recognized that his attack had demonstrated the effectiveness of individual initiative when supported by superior aircraft performance and pilot skill. The Supermarine Spitfire's combination of speed, maneuverability, and firepower made it ideally suited for the type of hit-and-run attacks that James had pioneered. More importantly, his success proved that German formations were vulnerable to disruption when attacked by pilots willing to abandon conventional tactics. Wing Commander Douglas Bader, already famous for his aggressive leadership despite having lost both legs in a peacetime flying accident, requested copies of James's debriefing report and began incorporating similar tactics into his own squadron's training. Bader recognized that the psychological effect of unexpected attacks could multiply the effectiveness of numerically inferior forces, particularly when those attacks targeted formation leaders and disrupted command structures. Within 3 months, Royal Air Force squadrons throughout southern England were practicing what became known as Whitmore attacks, high-speed diving assaults designed to break up German formations before they could reach their targets. The new tactics required exceptional pilot skill and precise timing, but proved devastatingly effective against German bombers and their escorts. German intelligence officers noticed the change in British tactics by November of 1940, but initially attributed it to random variations in pilot behavior rather than systematic tactical innovation. It was not until December that Luftwaffe analysts realized they were facing a coordinated shift in Royal Air Force combat doctrine. By that time, German bomber losses over Britain had increased by 30% and fighter pilot morale was suffering from repeated encounters with aggressive British attackers who seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish before effective countermeasures could be employed. The German response was predictable, but ultimately ineffective. Luftwaffe formations began flying at higher altitudes with larger fighter escorts, making them more difficult to intercept, but also reducing their bombing accuracy and operational effectiveness. More significantly, German fighter pilots became increasingly cautious about engaging British aircraft that appeared to be flying alone, having learned through bitter experience that such aircraft might be the leading edge of an aggressive attack. James himself was promoted to flight lieutenant and given command of a 4-aircraft flight within his squadron, with specific instructions to develop the aggressive tactics he had pioneered. His new role allowed him to train other pilots in the techniques of formation disruption and individual initiative that had made his September victory possible. By the spring of 1941, James was leading daily missions over occupied France, using his tactics to attack German airfields and supply convoys. His flight achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of 7-1, the highest in fighter command, and became the model for similar units throughout the Royal Air Force. But the personal cost of his innovation was significant. James discovered that the psychological pressure of repeatedly engaging superior enemy forces was cumulative and unrelenting. Unlike pilots who flew in traditional formations with the support of their squadron mates, James and his flight operated alone most of the time, relying on individual skill and courage to survive encounters with German fighters who now knew to expect aggressive British attacks. The constant tension of being outnumbered began to affect his sleep, his appetite, and his relationships with fellow pilots, who found his intensity increasingly difficult to tolerate. By the autumn of 1941, James Whitmore had been credited with 17 confirmed aerial victories and had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 bars, making him one of the most decorated pilots in fighter command. But he had also been grounded twice for exhaustion and once for insubordination after refusing to abandon a search for a missing member of his flight. Squadron leader Mathers, now promoted to wing commander, recognized that James's aggressive tactics were consuming him physically and emotionally. In November, James was posted to the Royal Air Force Staff College as an instructor, with orders to develop a formal training program based on his combat innovations. The transition from combat flying to classroom instruction was difficult for James, but it allowed him to systematize the tactical insights he had gained through 18 months of aggressive combat. His course, officially titled Advanced Fighter Tactics, became required training for all Royal Air Force squadron leaders and flight commanders. The curriculum emphasized individual initiative, formation disruption, and psychological warfare against numerically superior opponents. Students learned to calculate approach angles, timing, and escape routes for attacks against large enemy formations. Most importantly, they learned to overcome the natural human reluctance to engage superior forces by understanding that aggressive action often provided better survival odds than defensive maneuvering. James's teaching methods were unconventional but effective. He required his students to fly simulated attacks against multiple opponents, gradually increasing the numerical disadvantage until they could maintain tactical composure while outnumbered 10-1. He taught them to identify formation leaders and target them specifically, knowing that eliminating command aircraft would create confusion throughout entire enemy formations. He emphasized the importance of surprise, speed, and shock effect over sustained combat, showing his students how to achieve maximum destruction in minimum time before escaping to fight again. The psychological component of his instruction was equally important. James had learned through personal experience that the fear of engaging superior forces could be overcome through careful preparation and realistic training. His students practiced emergency procedures until they became automatic responses, reducing the mental workload required during actual combat and allowing them to focus on tactical decisions rather than aircraft control. They studied German formation procedures and radio protocols, learning to anticipate enemy reactions and exploit predictable responses. Most significantly, they learned to think of themselves as force multipliers rather than individual pilots, understanding that one aggressive aircraft could achieve the tactical effect of an entire squadron if properly employed. By the time the United States entered the war in December of 1941, James Whitmore's tactical innovations had been adopted by Royal Air Force squadrons throughout Europe and North Africa. American fighter pilots arriving in Britain received training in his methods as part of their operational orientation, and many carried his techniques to the Pacific Theater, where they proved equally effective against Japanese formations. The ripple effects of his 30-second engagement over Portsmouth had transformed aerial warfare itself, proving that individual courage and tactical innovation could overcome numerical superiority when supported by superior training and equipment. But James never fully recovered from the psychological strain of his combat service, and his post-war life reflected the hidden costs of the heroism he had displayed. James Whitmore left the Royal Air Force in April of 1946 with the rank of squadron leader and returned to his family's village in Yorkshire, where he married Sarah Elizabeth Morton, a nurse who had worked in military hospitals throughout the war. Their wedding was a quiet affair attended by 12 people, including 3 of James's former students who had survived the war and credited his training with saving their lives. Sarah understood that her husband carried invisible wounds from his service, nightmares and anxieties that no medal or citation could heal. She also understood that he had done something extraordinary, something that had changed the course of aerial warfare and saved the lives of countless Allied airmen. James took a position as chief pilot for a small aviation company in Leeds, ferrying passengers and cargo around northern England in converted military aircraft. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, even to his wife, and actively avoided publicity about his combat record. When aviation magazines requested interviews about his tactical innovations, he declined politely but firmly. When the Royal Air Force invited him to ceremonies honoring Battle of Britain veterans, he sent regrets and stayed home. His colleagues at the aviation company knew he was a war veteran, but had no idea they were working with one of the most influential fighter pilots in history. James preferred it that way. He had learned during the war that heroism was often indistinguishable from survival, and that the men who talked most about courage were usually those who had experienced it least. In 1952, Sarah gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth, followed 2 years later by a son they named William after James's father. James proved to be a devoted father who taught his children to fly model airplanes and explained the principles of aerodynamics with the patience of a born instructor. He never told them about the September morning when he had faced 20 German fighters alone, but he taught them his father's lesson about thinking beyond expectations and seeing opportunities that others missed. Elizabeth grew up to become an aerospace engineer, designing navigation systems for commercial aircraft. William became a mathematics professor who specialized in probability theory and statistical analysis. Both credited their father with teaching them to approach complex problems from unexpected angles and to trust their own judgment even when it conflicted with conventional wisdom. James's marriage to Sarah lasted 53 years, ending only with her death from cancer in 1999. Throughout their marriage, she encouraged him to write about his wartime experiences, believing that his tactical insights could benefit future generations of pilots. James consistently refused, claiming that the lessons he had learned were too personal and too specific to be useful to others. But after Sarah's death, he began work on a memoir that he intended as a private record for his children and grandchildren. The manuscript, discovered after his own death in 2004, revealed the full extent of his post-war struggles with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. It also contained detailed tactical analyses of his most significant combat engagements, including the 32nd attack that had made him famous within military aviation circles. James had never forgotten a single detail of that September morning: the moisture on his gloves, the sound of his engine at maximum power, the faces of German pilots in the split seconds before he opened fire. He had replayed the engagement thousands of times in his mind, analyzing every decision and calculating alternative outcomes. His memoir revealed that he had suffered survivor's guilt for decades, wondering whether his aggressive tactics had unnecessarily endangered other pilots who attempted to emulate his methods without possessing his combination of skill, experience, and intuitive timing. The memoir also contained correspondence from more than 40 former students and fellow pilots who had used James's tactics successfully during the war. Flight Lieutenant Robert Sterling, James's closest friend from his original squadron, had written in 1948 to describe how Whitmore's training had enabled him to survive a 12-to-1 engagement over Germany by disrupting a formation of Focke-Wulf, 190 fighters. Squadron leader Michael Patterson had credited James's instruction with his ability to lead successful attacks against German jet aircraft during the final months of the war, when conventional tactics proved inadequate against faster enemy fighters. Most significantly, Group Captain Douglas Bader had written a detailed analysis of how James's tactical innovations had influenced the development of Royal Air Force fighter doctrine throughout the war, comparing his contribution to those of legendary figures like Oswald Boelcke and Manfred von Richthofen. Bader argued that James's 32nd engagement had demonstrated principles of aerial combat that remained relevant to jet aircraft and guided missile systems, making him one of the most important tactical innovators in aviation history. But the letter that meant most to James came from Hans Joachim Marseille himself, written in 1951 during a reunion of former Luftwaffe pilots in West Germany. Marseille, who had survived the war and become a commercial airline pilot, had learned James's identity through military historian contacts and wanted to express his professional respect for the British pilot who had nearly killed him over Portsmouth. Marseille's letter described the German perspective of that September engagement, confirming James's tactical analysis and acknowledging that the attack had fundamentally changed Luftwaffe formation procedures. More personally, Marseille wrote that being defeated by James had taught him humility and forced him to abandon the overconfidence that had made him vulnerable to innovative attacks. The two men never met in person, but they exchanged several letters discussing the tactical and psychological aspects of aerial combat. Their correspondence, preserved in James's memoir, provided unique insights into the professional relationship that could exist between former enemies who had tested each other's skills at the highest level. Marseille died in a commercial aviation accident in 1968, but his final letter to James expressed gratitude for having survived their encounter and learned lessons that had made him a better pilot and a wiser man. James's memoir concluded with a detailed analysis of how individual initiative and tactical innovation had shaped the outcome of World War II, not just in aerial combat, but across all domains of warfare. He argued that the conflict had been won by ordinary men and women who had refused to accept conventional limitations and had found ways to achieve extraordinary results through intelligence, courage, and determination. His own 32nd engagement was merely one example of how individual heroism could change the course of history when supported by superior training, equipment, and institutional flexibility. James Whitmore died peacefully in his sleep on November 15, 2004, at the age of 86. His funeral was attended by more than 200 people, including veterans from 6 different countries who had been influenced by his tactical innovations. The Royal Air Force provided an honor guard, and his casket was draped with the flag he had served with such distinction 64 years earlier. The legacy of James Whitmore's 32nd victory extends far beyond the specific tactical innovations he pioneered during World War II. Modern military analysts studying his engagement have identified principles of combat effectiveness that remain relevant to contemporary warfare, from individual fighter aircraft to unmanned aerial systems and cyber warfare. The fundamental insight that aggressive individual action can disrupt superior enemy forces through psychological shock and formation disruption has been validated repeatedly in conflicts from Korea to Afghanistan. Air Force academies throughout the world now teach case studies based on James's September attack, using it to illustrate the importance of individual initiative and tactical flexibility in rapidly changing combat environments. The engagement has become a standard example of how numerical disadvantage can be overcome through superior training, equipment utilization, and willingness to accept calculated risks. More significantly, James's example demonstrates how institutional learning can amplify individual innovation, transforming personal heroism into systematic tactical advancement that benefits entire military organizations. His 30 seconds of combat action resulted in decades of improved fighter pilot training and saved thousands of Allied lives throughout the remainder of World War II. But perhaps the most important lesson from James Whitmore's story concerns the relationship between courage and calculation. His attack on 20 German fighters was not a desperate gamble or an act of suicidal bravery. It was a carefully calculated decision based on precise tactical analysis and executed with a skill that comes only from extensive training and natural aptitude. James had recognized that conventional defensive tactics offered no realistic hope of success against the German formation, while aggressive offensive action provided at least a possibility of disrupting their attack and saving his squadron. His willingness to accept personal risk in order to protect others exemplified the highest traditions of military service. But his success depended equally on the technical competence and tactical intelligence that allowed him to convert courage into effective action. Modern readers living in an era of precision-guided weapons and computer-controlled aircraft might wonder whether individual heroism remains relevant to contemporary warfare. James Whitmore's story suggests that technology can amplify human capabilities, but cannot replace the fundamental importance of individual judgment, creativity, and moral courage. The pilots who operate today's advanced fighter aircraft face decisions that are fundamentally similar to those James confronted over Portsmouth. How to achieve mission success while minimizing friendly casualties. How to overcome numerical or technological disadvantages through tactical innovation. How to balance personal survival against collective responsibility. The tools have changed, but the essential human elements of warfare remain constant. Individual initiative, tactical flexibility, and willingness to accept risk for the benefit of others continue to determine the difference between victory and defeat, between survival and destruction. James Whitmore's 30-second engagement reminds us that history pivots on moments when ordinary individuals choose to do extraordinary things, when personal courage intersects with professional competence to produce results that seem mathematically impossible, but prove historically decisive. His story asks a question that resonates across generations and conflicts, a question that each of us must answer according to our own circumstances and convictions. When faced with impossible odds and inadequate options, when conventional wisdom offers no path to success and institutional guidance provides no hope of survival, when the only choice is between certain failure and improbable heroism, what would you do? Would you follow the rules that promised safety but guaranteed defeat? Or would you break the rules that limited possibility but offered hope? Would you accept the mathematics of numerical disadvantage, or would you gamble everything on the calculation that individual courage, properly applied, could change the fundamental equation of conflict? James Whitmore answered that question in 30 seconds over Portsmouth on a September morning in 1940. But the question itself remains timeless and universal. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means when the mathematics of survival demand the impossible, and individual heroism becomes the only rational response to impossible circumstances.